Hello, and today we're going to show you how to install ECUTEK on your Windows laptop. The first step is to visit ECUTEK.com. Here we are. And you go to Downloads, and you're going to choose the ECUTEK app downloader. Download the latest version. And I've already installed the latest version. I have it right here. And there's information about my dongle. We're going to download the software that's associated with this dongle ID. Now, if your tuner has not activated your dongle, if you received it and it hasn't been activated, which it's supposed to be activated, but it's not, then this process will not complete, and you'll get some kind of error message at the end saying that the software wasn't downloaded. If you experience this problem and you need assistance and you can't reach your tuner, feel free to contact me and I can register the dongle for you. All right, got this agreement here. Get this message. All right. All right, here we go. So, don't need that anymore. Here's our, okay. So let me explain this interface a little bit. Whenever your ECUTEK cable is plugged in, the one that would normally be plugged into the vehicle, you'll have these two green boxes. Now, this doesn't mean it's connected to the vehicle. Simply, this means that the cable has been detected, the cable interface. It has nothing to do with the actual vehicle being plugged in. So if I were to unplug the cable, then these lights would go red like that. If I plug the cable back in, everything comes back to green. So first thing, let's talk about a couple things here. If you're using a Bluetooth interface and you want to make sure you have the latest firmware, you can go here to Vehicle Interface Firmware Update. Now, if you click on that, in my case, I'm being given the option of installing firmware off the computer here. But if you have a Bluetooth unit, you'll get a different pop-up, and that'll check with the server to see if there's any updates available. In some cases, you can use the built-in update option in the Bluetooth software when you're using your mobile device. But when that doesn't work, you can always connect it here to ProECU and try to directly update it from inside of here. Vehicle Interface Firmware Update. So let's see, what else do we have here? Really quite simple. You can open ROM files or you can open log files. Opening ROM files will allow you to open ROM files, but at the same time it won't allow you to edit them. You'll just be able to view certain details. But this video is going to be about opening log files and looking at them. So let's go ahead and open a log file. Let's go take a look at one of Justin's log files. Right here. Okay. Logs. Let's take a look at his original tune. Let's see. I'll pick the bigger one here. Now, sometimes with the larger log files, it can take a while to load. You just have to be patient. There we go. So the first screen, what I like to do on this first screen is here you can look at minimum and maximum values. So what's what's critical here is understanding some of these parameters. Now we can go through and talk in detail about a lot of these things. And some of the stuff is quite complex, but from a user point of view, I guess we need to focus on something simple. So one thing somebody might want to know is, for example, how hot did their coolant temperature get? So in this case, the vehicle did not exceed a coolant temperature of 88 degrees Fahrenheit under maximum here, and the coolest it was during this log was 83 degrees, and that might be useful for you. You can look at these AFR values, but because the vehicle has certain situations where the AFR will either spike or will dip very rich, these minimum and maximum values for the AFR itself, given the entire log, may not be very useful, and they're not in this case. Accelerator pedal position, here 4.65 volts means that the vehicle's accelerator pedal was put all the way down to the floor at some point. It doesn't say for how long, but we can look at that later. Atmospheric pressure is what it is. It's generally pressure of the atmosphere. These custom map values, this is all custom programming that the tuner could put into the tune. You can see that this particular tune did not have any kind of custom activity happening. Engine load for naturally aspirated vehicles typically will be, under full throttle, will be anywhere between 100 to maybe 120. If the vehicle is breathing exceptionally well, if it's a high compression engine, sometimes you can exceed that. If it's a boosted vehicle, you typically see values close to 200% under maximum boost, full throttle. We've got engine speed. Fuel trims, it's a whole different subject. Generally, you want them as close to 100% as possible. It's okay for short terms to move around and be sporadic. They do that. That's what they're there for. Long terms, you generally want to keep them pretty tight. Ignition correction, this is a big one. Generally, you don't want to see very negative values, and you also don't want to see positive values either. You want to see everything around 0. That usually indicates that your vehicle is tuned well, and ECU is not trying to do any kind of crazy adjustment one way or the other. Ignition timing calculated. Again, minimum and maximum values here don't really mean much. Then you've got your intake air temperature. How hot did it get? You've got noise level per cylinder. Now again, these values on their own, without looking at where the data was collected, they don't really provide much value. Even something like this, looking at the maximum threshold per cylinder, from the factory, these thresholds are set very, very high at the very low end, such as 400 RPM. They're typically set to the maximum value. So it's not surprising to see something like this. But, to really understand its effect, you have to look at the data log, and we'll get into that. Manifold absolute pressure, pretty common under full throttle to see something like that. We've got a couple other values here. Vehicle speed, you hit about 100 miles an hour. Hey, it's pretty fast. Probably driving in Mexico, maybe some other country. All right, so the first thing I like to do is when I open this program, it likes to load all this stuff, and that slows things down. So first thing I do is I uncheck all the parameters. The next thing I do is I click on this accelerator pedal, because that's telling me what the user is doing. The person that's driving the vehicle, they're demanding something of the car. So over here you can see a nice straight sort of like a run over here that he held the pedal down. And if you click with the mouse anywhere in this area, it'll highlight a small dot here, and that dot will reflect here the time point and the voltage of the accelerator pedal. Now if you recall, full throttle is about 4.65. So if we click here and we create a little white box and zoom in on that area, our window will be narrowed down. So you can see here this person was accelerating, and we can look at their actual engine speed here. If we check the engine speed box, we can see the engine RPM was increasing. Then here the pedal was released, the shift was probably performed. Sometimes you can record the gear, which in this case, this vehicle does not have synchro rev, so we were not able to keep track of what gear is actually in. You can see the length of time between each of these accelerations is increasing. It takes longer and longer for the engine speed to increase. Typically, that means he's in a higher gear. So let's take this. Let's see. Let's take this last pull here. We'll zoom in on that. You can see it's all flatline acceleration here. The next thing we want to do is, just because he's requesting full throttle, it doesn't necessarily mean the vehicle's going full throttle. We want to look at throttle position. Throttle position can vary based on traction control and other things. This is the actual position of the throttle, and in this case, the throttle was fully open the entire time. So now we're going to go to 2D graphing, okay? And first thing I like to do is to get these axes here from engine speed. I'd like to convert them over to time, because we want to see what's happening over time as the vehicle is accelerating. And we're going to uncheck all this, and let's look at AFRs first. So we got your AFRs, we've got engine speed over here. There's our engine speed. And let's see here. Okay. Engine speed. Okay, we've got engine speed, AFR target. Okay. So clicking the down arrow right here will bring the engine speed and the AFR. Let's see, let's make this a little easier to see. Let's pick our AFR for bank 1. There we go. AFR for bank 2. All right, so we've got our AFR for bank 1 and bank 2. We can see our AFR target is in red, this line right here. So in general, we're not running lean relative to the target. We are running just below the target here. And by moving these arrows up and down, we can rescale the situation so we can better visualize the data. So AFR looks okay. Now over here, when he first started off the acceleration, what I find a bit interesting is that the engine speed went down, then went back up again, and then down. There's some kind of strange behavior happening here. And later we learned that the vehicle had a loose crankshaft position sensor, which can cause erratic readings like this. Or I think he had a loose flywheel, or there was something wrong with it. Okay. Next, we're going to look at ignition correction. So let's go back. So AFR looked okay. You know, we had a particular target. We went rich. We didn't quite hit the target, but it's not too bad. Something else you can look at the same time is you can look at your long-term fuel trims, because those can be applied during acceleration. Let's look at just one bank here. Let's get rid of RPM, and let's scroll down here. Okay, so you can see the blue line here, long-term fuel trim was 1%. So 1% less fuel, and it's still pretty much within range. Another interesting observation is that the pink line, which is bank 1, is actually running a bit leaner, or reading a bit leaner from the sensor and being reported as such, than the other bank 2, which tends to be a little bit richer. And there's different ways that you can adjust these things inside the tune to line things up better. Okay. Let's go ahead and take a look at, so that we looked at AFRs, they look kind of okay here. Let's take a look at ignition correction. So that's timing being pulled. Here you can see 4 degrees of timing was pulled the whole time for some other event that probably occurred earlier. Instead, let's compare the calculated timing, which is what the vehicle would normally run, versus the actual timing that it ran. That's what we're going to do here. So let's go back, look at our ignition timing calculated. So here we can see that the vehicle ran more timing down low and then less timing later on. So useful information if you're comparing and trying to get a sense of where the vehicle is at as far as if it's been tuned. So if the vehicle was not tuned, it would have performed this blue line here. If the vehicle was tuned, which in this case it was by another shop, then it would be executing the green line here. Any ignition correction that is applied, let's pull up the ignition correction, which was -4. It'll just be a straight line right here, this line on the bottom, the purple line. That is applied, and the actual ignition timing that you see is the timing after the -4 has been applied to it. So now let's go investigate a little bit, and let's find out where the timing was originally pulled. So let's go and look at the ignition correction. I'm going to right click and that'll zoom back out. And here we can see there's a lot of activity here. Now somebody might say, hey, this engine's noisy. It's just pulling timing because it's noisy. It's running less timing than stock or whatever it is. But you don't really know these things. You have to analyze it a little bit. And most of the time, when we look at events like this, where there's a lot of timing being pulled, we don't really know if it's being pulled for noise or not. The only way to really know for sure is to use an independent knock detection device, such as a Plex V2 or one of these other knock detection tools. So we're going to zoom in here on this event where the ECU is pulling timing. And we're going to look at a couple things we're going to look at. First, we want to see how were the AFRs when the vehicle is pulling timing. So we're going to go back in here. We're going to uncheck all that. And we're going to look at the AFR of bank 1 and bank 2. There we go. Okay, here you can see that there is a difference between the two banks, and this bank did go a little, leaner than the other one. Let's check the target here. Here's our target. It's the blue line here. So we're below target, or with the target that's been set by the tuner. So technically speaking, we shouldn't be having any issues with knock as a result of running lean on either one of these banks because we're below target. So I'm not too worried about that. Now, the ignition correction happened pretty much this whole time here. So even when this event happened here where the two became a little different, the balance between the two sides of the bank 1 and 2 increased, didn't really seem to have much of an increase in the amount of timing that the ECU took out. So one thing we might want to look at is what the calculated timing was versus the actual timing. So there's the actual timing and there's the calculated timing. So again, the calculated timing, which is in this color here, is what the engine would have normally, the ECU would have ran if the car wasn't tuned. But we tuned it, or someone tuned it, and now it's running more timing. The interesting thing here is that this engine is a high compression engine. And a high compression engine is going to want less timing, not more timing. Of course, there's variation in that depending on the situation, but I suspect that this vehicle has timing that's over advanced. So we're going to look at the individual sensors, knock sensors, and we're going to see which one is causing this timing to be pulled. All right, so we're going to highlight our ignition correction so we can see where it was. It happened here. And now we're going to look at each individual knock sensor value. Now there's two knock sensors, but what the ECU is able to do is there's some filtering that happens based on what the ignition timing is doing and the firing order and all that. They determine, the ECU is able to determine which cylinder is knocking at that given time. So the noise level from each cylinder as it's perceived by the ECU is indicated by this value here. So you can see it kind of moves up and down. And that's normal to see that. There's a particular frequency that this sound is picked up on. So if your exhaust is rattling or something like that, generally would not activate, it will not pick that up because it's listening on a very specific frequency. Now the threshold for cylinder 1, right over here, so you can see it's this line up here. as it was recorded in this particular log, none of the events crossed that line. And typically, if an event crosses that line, it will cause ignition timing to be pulled. Now, keep in mind that there are events which are missed by the act of logging. So when you're data logging, there are some events that are not captured. And you may run into situations where none of the cylinders will be crossing over this line, and you'll still have timing that will be pulled by the ECU, because the ECU doesn't miss anything. But the logging application, when you're data logging from your vehicle, it can't keep up with the amount of data that's available, and it does not display all events. Let's take a look at cylinder 2. And here we can see that it crossed a few times. Cylinder 3. A couple spikes there, could be knock that didn't cross the threshold. Cylinder 4, definitely some interesting events happening, a lot of noise on the engine. And cylinder 6. So I ended up tuning this vehicle later, and we resolved all these issues with the knock, and the timing was over advanced. But this is a good way to be able to tell some of these techniques to understand if the vehicle's timing is being pulled because it's running lean or if it's over advanced. Sometimes you just have to try to pull timing back and see if it helps. It can be complicated. Something else we can look at is when we're using the 2D graph mode, we can switch back over to engine and RPM here. And if we want to know for a given RPM what was the maximum recorded value for, let's say, noise for a particular cylinder, given a particular threshold. So we can, for example, plot cylinder 6 noise level against cylinder 6 threshold. And here we don't really, it's not a really good example. Let's see here. Let's look at a pull. Accelerator pedal. Let's look over here. Zoom into that. So given these events, the entire collection of noise from cylinder, let's say cylinder 6, is this. And the threshold is that. And so you can see that the threshold is generally this is the threshold for that particular cylinder under these RPM conditions. And that is how the threshold is defined. It's defined based on the rotational speed of the engine and the particular cylinder number, which is 6. So let's take a look at maybe 4. It looks like that. Here you can see cylinder 4 crossed over a couple times. And there's a few other modes here. Don't really use a lot of these. Mainly I typically end up using the other 2 modes.